Okay, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you guys for joining us. And welcome to today's webinar, From Science-Based Policy to Standard-Based Practice, Building the Next Generation of Resilient Coastal Infrastructure. I am Mequela Moreno. I'm the Environmental Affairs Manager here at ECOncrete, and I'll be serving as the moderator today. So a little bit of housekeeping before we start. Everyone has joined this webinar. You are on mute. Additionally, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available online afterwards. Today's session is going to be composed of 3 presentations, about 10 to 12 minutes each. If you have questions and answers, please wait till the end. We're going to do a little short questions after each presentations. We're also going to have a discussion at the end of this webinar. Also, the Institution for Sustainability Infrastructure has approved this webinar for ENV-SP credential maintenance. So for ENV-SP certified engineers, this is an opportunity to earn 1.5 units toward your yearly Envision Sustainability Professional credential maintenance. So please, I will put my email in the chat to contact me after the webinar so I can give you the code so you can receive your credential maintenance credits. So today's discussion brings experts from science, policy, and implementation to explore how coastal infrastructure has evolved, where we are today, and what it will take to move these innovation approaches from pilot project to standard practice. So before we begin, I would like everyone in the audience to think about one question. When you guys think about future coastal infrastructure, what is the single biggest change needed to move from isolated pilot project to widespread adaptation? So please keep this in mind. So to understand where coastal infrastructure is headed, it is important to first understand where we've been. Our first speaker is Dr. Maria Petrova. Dr. Petrova is a professor of sustainability, energy, and environmental policy with extensive experience in climate resiliency, decarbonization, evidence-based decision-making. Her work focuses on helping organizations navigate complex environmental challenges while ensuring sustainability into long-term planning and governance. Today, she's going to help us understand how our approach to coastal infrastructure has evolved and why resiliency is increasingly viewed as both a management and governance challenge. The floor is yours, Maria.
Thank you very much, Mequela. Very happy to be here. So as the first speaker, I will step back from specific projects and technologies and ask a much broader question. And with that, I would like to share my slides so you can all see them. 1 second, make sure it's all full screen. It's good, right? You can see well? Yes, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. So the broader question that I would like us to think about today is how has our understanding of coastal resilience has evolved, and what does that evolution tell us about decision-making today? And I have a simple argument to make that the evolution of coastal resilience is simply the evolution of management thinking. Understanding that evolution helps explain how sustainability frameworks, climate policy, and evidence-based approaches are integrated into decision-making today. Before discussing resilience, we need to understand what is meant by coastal resilience. Coastal resilience is often associated with flooding, but in reality, it's much broader than this. Resilience concerns the ability of interconnected systems to continue functioning despite disturbance and change. These systems include infrastructure, ecosystems, communities, economies, and governance institutions. What happens to one part affects all the others. A transportation network, for example, depends on infrastructure. Infrastructure depends on ecosystems that provide protective services. Communities depend on both infrastructure and ecosystems. Economic activity depends on all of these. As a result, coastal resilience is best understood as a systems challenge rather than an engineering challenge. This may seem obvious today, but historically, it was not how coastal management was understood. Over the past 70 years, governments, corporations, infrastructure operators, and communities have progressively changed how they define risk, how they evaluate success, and ultimately how they make decisions. This transformation has fundamentally altered approaches to coastal development, urban planning, environmental management, and climate adaptation. The evolution of coastal resilience can be understood through three broad management paradigms. As you can see on the slide, engineering control, then risk management and system thinking, and adaptive governance. So each of these paradigms emerged because the previous approach became insufficient for addressing increasing complexity and uncertainty. And let us look now more closely at each one of them. So following World War II, coastal management was dominated by an engineering control paradigm. What do we mean by that? Governments around the world invested heavily in infrastructure designed to control natural hazards and support economic development. The assumption was straightforward. If risks could be measured, engineers could design infrastructure to control nature and prevent damage. One of the most famous examples is the Dutch response to the catastrophic North Sea flood of 1953. The resulting Delta Works project remains one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects ever undertaken. Similar approaches emerged elsewhere through the Thames Barrier in London, which is the top picture, coastal armoring projects in Japan, and extensive levee systems throughout the United States. These projects were highly successful because they managed to reduce risk, protect communities, and enable economic growth. Success was measured through reliability, safety, and economic performance. Importantly, this paradigm was not wrong. It solved many of the challenges it was designed to solve. However, over time, new challenges emerged that could not be addressed through engineering alone. By the late 20th century, ecosystem degradation, urbanization, and increasing system complexity exposed the limits of purely engineering solutions. Environmental degradation became much more apparent. Wetlands started disappearing, urbanization expanded into vulnerable areas, estuaries were altered, infrastructure systems increasingly became interdependent. At that same time, climate variability challenged assumptions about predictability. And during this period, resilience thinking emerged. At this time, the ecologist Holling introduced the concept of resilience as the capacity of systems to continue functioning under changing conditions. And this shifted attention away from controlling hazards and toward understanding how systems respond to disturbances. Building on Holling's work, scholars such as Folk and Eleanor Ostrom, who is Nobel Prize winner, expanded resilience thinking to include social ecological systems and governance institutions. So the question was no longer how do we stop hazards, but rather how do we maintain function despite those hazards? And this perspective influenced integrated coastal management, ecosystem-based management, and sustainable development. So attention focused on understanding interaction among economic, ecological, and social systems. And again, the Dutch Room for the River program illustrates that shift very well. Instead of further constraining rivers, planners redesigned the landscapes to accommodate natural processes while supporting communities and economic activity. This shift reflected systems thinking in practice. The goal was no longer maximizing control over nature. Rather, the goal became enhancing the capacity of the broader system to function under changing conditions. In other words, to reduce vulnerability while enhancing overall system performance rather than maximizing control. What happened in the next time frame? Climate change introduced a new challenge, and that was uncertainty. Historically, infrastructure planning relied on past experience. The future was expected to resemble the past. Climate change disrupted that assumption. Sea levels are rising, storm patterns are changing, environmental conditions are becoming less predictable. So what happens is basically strategic frameworks provide the long-term vision. Climate science provides evidence regarding future risks. Climate policy translates the evidence into goals, incentives, and accountability mechanisms. And governance structures use those policies to guide investment decisions. The challenge is no longer simply managing risk. It's how do we manage uncertainty? This shift has driven the emergence of what I refer to as adaptive governance. It acknowledges that uncertainty cannot be eliminated, but instead, institutions must learn, monitor, evaluate, and adjust over time. Again, the Dutch Delta program provides one of the clearest examples of that approach. Through dynamic adaptive policy pathways, planners recognize that no single solution will remain optimal for a long time or indefinitely. Instead, they develop flexible pathways that can evolve as conditions change. This approach treats decision-making as continuous learning process rather than a one-time choice. And this is where evidence-based decision-making becomes critically important. Evidence is no longer used simply to adjust decisions. It becomes part of an ongoing cycle of learning and adaptation. This evolution in management thinking has also transformed the kinds of projects we see emerging around the world. The Boston Climate Ready initiative provides an excellent example of adaptive governance in practice. What is most interesting about the Boston Climate Ready initiative is not any individual project, but the integration of all of the processes. Climate science informs planning decisions, public health data informs in vulnerability assessments, community engagement shapes priorities, and economic development objectives are considered alongside resilience goals. And this is exactly what integrated decision-making looks like. Similar principles can be seen, as you can see on the pictures here, of Rotterdam's water squares and Copenhagen's cloudburst plan, where resilience projects simultaneously provide economic, social, and environmental benefits. Increasingly, these initiatives also incorporate nature-based and hybrid solutions that work with natural systems rather than relying exclusively on engineering infrastructure. And rather than replacing traditional infrastructure, they increasingly complement it through hybrid solutions. So how do strategic frameworks, climate policy, and evidence-based approaches come together in decision-making? I would suggest here, as you can see on the slide, 4 elements. First, strategic frameworks define long-term goals and priorities. Second, climate policy creates direction, incentives, and accountability. Third, evidence provides the information needed to evaluate risks and opportunities. And fourth, Adaptive governance enables institutions to learn and adjust as conditions change. When these elements work together, resilience becomes more than a project or an infrastructure investment. It becomes an organizational capacity and capability. In essence, strategic frameworks tell us where we want to go. Climate policy tells us what commitments we must make. Evidence tells us what is happening, and adaptive governance allows us to adjust our course as conditions change. And that, I would argue, is the central lesson emerging from the evolution of coastal resilience thinking. So I would like to conclude with one final observation. When we look at examples from the Netherlands, from Boston, from Rotterdam, from Copenhagen, and elsewhere, we are more, they're just not a collection of projects. That's not what we see. We see an evolution in how societies understand and manage complexity. The future of coastal resilience will depend not only on stronger infrastructure, but on institutions that can learn, adapt, and govern under uncertainty. And in that sense, resilience has become a fundamental principle of sustainability management. And that helps explain why nature-based and hybrid solutions are increasingly central to resilience planning. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Maria. So one thing that really stood out to me when you're discussing adaptation and governance is how can these organizations balance the need for immediate infrastructure investments with the uncertainty about future climate conditions?
I would say that one of the most important insights of resilience research is that uncertainty should for no reason be a reason for inaction under no circumstance. Historically, planners try to identify what the optimal solutions should be based on predictions about the future. Climate change makes those predictions, however, very uncertain, and we can't be certain about any future conditions. So the Dutch concept of dynamic adaptive policy pathways provides a very useful example. Rather than committing to one large solution based on a single future scenario, what the Dutch organizations are doing is they're identifying actions that make sense today while preserving options for future adaptation. And I think that this approach allows organizations to act immediately while maintaining flexibility as conditions evolve.
Awesome. Thank you for that response. So one key takeaway from this presentation for the audience that resilience requires more than good science and engineering. It also requires institution policy and decision-making frameworks that can adapt over time. So that naturally brings us to our next speaker to help us understand how science is translated into policy and practice. So I'm pleased to introduce Laura Tam. Laura is the Chief Executive Officer of the Bay Planning Coalition. She leads a network of more than 150 organizations focused on policy, funding, and regulation throughout San Francisco Bay region. With more than 25 years of experience in climate resiliency, natural resources policy, and sustainable planning, Laura has built partnerships across government, industry, and environmental organizations to advance regional resiliency initiatives. Laura, now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And Maria, that was such a wonderful presentation. I found myself like over the last 25 years of my career seeing those eras and frameworks coming to light and how we're in this new era. And I'd love to hear after I present what we're doing over here in the Bay Area. I'd love to hear your view of how we're doing at meeting those sort of systems needs that you describe. So hopefully you can all see my shared screen. Doing the full, getting the slideshow going here. Can everybody see that? Is it good?
Yep, it's good.
Okay, perfect. Well, again, thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and to share a little bit of a view from San Francisco Bay, where I've been working on coastal resilience planning and policy since the middle era that Dr. Petrova described, the 1990s to the 2010s, where we started to realize that climate change was here and we needed to adapt appropriately and not just manage risk. Just a moment about Bay Planning Coalition. As Mequela mentioned, BPC is a 40-year-old member-supported nonprofit and cross-sector alliance of public and private entities who share a common goal of a healthy bay and a resilient waterfront economy. We connect and represent our members to advance practical solutions for the bay's natural resources and infrastructure. So this is our region. It's home to 7.5 million people, 101 local governments, over 400 miles of shoreline, and the largest estuary on the West Coast. The shoreline today serves multiple beneficial uses, including transportation, industry, ports and airports, water and wastewater plants and conveyances, public trails, restored and historic marshlands, habitat for sensitive species, and more. Important for the sea level rise, water quality impairment, flooding, lack of funding for shoreline investment, infrastructure, and improvement are all significant current and future challenges. It's been estimated by our regional metropolitan planning organization that it will cost $90 billion to protect the region for sea level rise by 2050. And about $6 billion has been identified to date. So we have a big funding gap to close to address all the areas of shoreline through a variety of strategies to prepare and restore our wetland environments for sea level rise and anticipated climate change. Today's vulnerability, as most of you probably know, is often the result of yesterday's land use decisions. So our bay and our Bay Delta here used to look more like this. The green area is the extent of tidal wetlands in 1800. 90% of the tidal wetlands in the bay shown here have since been filled and diked. Most of this was to reclaim land for agriculture, for industry, for maritime activities, and other things. So what we have today in terms of tidal lands are the red areas. Our region has done a lot of work to invest in developing a plan to restore 100,000 acres of wetlands by 2030. We're getting there. We've made a lot of progress in the last 30 years, but we have a long way to go. And because of the filling that occurred in the last century and up until we decided that was no longer okay, most of our dense urban developments and where people live exist in the green areas. So we have a lot of low-lying developed areas vulnerable to future sea level rise. And this is a common narrative in urbanized estuaries around the country and indeed around the world. Sea level in the Bay Area has risen over a half foot in the last 100 years. And we know this because the nation's oldest tidal gauge is actually at the Golden Gate. Our state agencies are really proactive about science research and translation into technical guidance. So here, OPC stands for the Ocean Protection Council, which is a group of state coastal agencies and habitat agencies and the governor's office that periodically assesses the state of the science and makes sea level rise estimates. In fact, the state as a whole has been doing really robust climate science assessments and churning out statewide adaptations every 4 years since 2009. So from that research, we know that by 2100, statewide sea levels are expected to rise between 1.5 and 3 feet, and even higher amounts cannot be ruled out depending on the feedback loops that are occurring in the Arctic and other places, and with changing global weather patterns, ocean heat, and other things. And as you all probably know, sea level rise, when combined with extreme storms and higher tides, will result in accelerated cliff and bluff erosion, which is very challenging, not so much in San Francisco Bay, but on the coast of California. Flooding, beach loss, and importantly for within the Bay Area, the mobilization of subsurface contaminants. Going back to the outer coast for a second, scientists have estimated 20%, 20 to 30% loss of California's beaches with no intervention. And I don't know if you have seen in the news, just this past week, we had a very high tide week in California. Sadly, some lives were lost, which is really sad. But if you look at some of the infrastructural impacts, there was a pier that hosted a lot of fishing activities and a restaurant in Pacifica, which is just south of San Francisco, and the pier collapsed. The restaurant was torn down. They're trying to rebuild it. I don't know how well that's going to go. And then importantly, we have an area in Orange County called Crystal Cove, which is a beautiful beach that had these old cottages that were they're still there. They did not get wiped out by the high tides this week, but there was significant damage to the beach. And if you just Google some of the images from what happened there just this week during the summer, during a high tide, you'll see that beach loss is really coming at us, and its consequences are really tragic for communities and the places that they love along the shoreline. So to respond to the challenge, there are a lot of entities involved, something our previous presenter also shared. There is research and science, which is being updated all the time. There's a lot of sensitive habitat and species with special protections against development-related losses, but not necessarily against environmental change. There are plans and policies that affect coastal areas, land use, and project suitability. There is infrastructure that must be repaired and reinvested. There's dredging, shipping, and navigation and channels that must be maintained. There are local and state governments who add layers onto existing of decades of old policies. There's public and private funding for all of this. We are fortunate to have a number of serious stakeholder collaboratives within our region and probably in other places for sharing information and advancing solutions. But something that has really changed in terms of people's awareness since I started working on this issue in the late, before 2010, I'll say, before the common era of adaptive management frameworks, we now realize, everyone realizes, we have to work together within this shared geography to advance the innovative and time-sensitive approaches to coastal resilience that our region requires to stay ahead of sea level rise and manage coastal change. One thing many people already agree on, but is still slow to materialize, even though we have established regional habitat restoration goals, as I previously mentioned, are nature-based solutions. These are not just environmentally preferable, they can be more cost-effective over time and more adaptable as conditions change. The challenge with getting nature-based solutions into the ground is that upfront permitting costs and uncertainties make them harder to finance through traditional mechanisms. But they vary, and so do hybrid or traditional infrastructural approaches, which is why we developed, with funding from our regional water board, an adaptation atlas for the shoreline that shows what type of strategy is suitable for what type of shoreline based on geomorphic characteristics, such as whether the shoreline drops into deep water, or is there room for oysters or eelgrass or beaches or marsh restoration. This is something I put together and worked on as a co-author in a previous role a few years ago. We created the idea of a planning unit called Operational Landscape Units, or OLUs, which are areas of shoreline which are bigger than a city but smaller than a county, with sort of shared geophysical and land use characteristics that could potentially provide a blueprint for what kinds of adaptation strategies are going to work, whether nature-based or hybrid, who needs to work together among communities, residents, government agencies, scientists, and advocates to work together with nature to identify solutions. And this planning framework is being used today to design adaptation strategies in at least 3 counties in the Bay Area, and it's used by our regional agency, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission's planning guidance for cities developing adaptation strategies pursuant to a recent state law that was adopted to require them to do so by 2034. All this is good. I think we've also learned something in the past 15 years that I've been focused on, that I've been focusing on this topic, which is that planning is like we've moved on from that being the bottleneck, and now implementation is our biggest challenge because we agree we need to do, oops, I skipped ahead, sorry. Um, we agree that we need to plan with nature where we can. We agree that we need to do something about environmental change and protecting our assets and reinvesting in infrastructure. These agencies, though, that are involved in helping to permit these adaptive strategies are pursuing legitimate but different objectives. One agency might be focused on habitat protection, another on water quality, another on flood risk, another on navigation. A challenge is that reviews for projects often occur sequentially rather than concurrently. Our permitting systems were designed to evaluate discrete projects with fixed designs and to manage risk. But as again, the previous speaker, Maria, has mentioned, coastal adaptation projects are different. They need to be phased and adaptive and able to evolve as conditions change over time. Ironically, the traditional hard infrastructure frequently has a more predictable permitting pathway than nature-based solutions, even though nature-based approaches are increasingly recognized as an important part of long-term resilience. The good news is that we're starting to see movement here. California has something called its Cutting the Green Tape initiative, which has been looking for pathways to identify speeding up implementation for restoration projects. We have federal efforts like Nationwide Permit 54, which streamlines living shoreline approvals federally. We have new state adaptation planning requirements and proposed legislation that our organization is sponsoring right now to streamline resilience permitting, and they're all pointing in the same direction. I will briefly share two examples of why we feel some of these permitting reforms are necessary and why that's a key priority for our organization, Bay Planning Coalition, looking forward. At the top, this is a picture of the Redwood City, the Port of Redwood City. It's in San Mateo County. They were inspired to build a living shoreline in their area within a highly industrialized channel after seeing the success of similar construction techniques at the Port of San Diego. Although the Department of Fish and Wildlife at the state level really liked and approved San Diego's project readily, the Redwood Creek project was delayed more than a year. The application process required more than 100 pages of documentation, numerous site visits, multiple levels of review, all for a green project where an entity was trying to do the right thing on land it controlled, that was taken on voluntarily and with private funding to improve habitat. And to pilot the process of constructing a living shoreline at the port with the intent of doing more in the future. That's not the way we want our institutions to work when someone is bringing all the right things to moving forward. And then a second example is also in the same general area in San Mateo County following widespread flooding in 2022 and 2023. The Shoreline Governance Agency in this county was trying to secure 5-year permits to remove debris from a few flood-prone creeks, reducing a demonstrated flood risk in 6 cities and permanently impacting less than 1,000 square feet of tidal creek channel. Permitting took 3 years, is still delayed, and cost the permitting price tag was a full 1/2 of the cost of construction. So this project that project was only focused on coastal flooding today, not in the future, and it was a small project. So if we let small resilience projects like this take years to permit, scaling adaptation becomes very challenging. So this is my last slide. There is a lot of institutional knowledge and even resources and emerging favorable policy and laws that should have us in a different place in a new era in 20 years than we are today. And 20 years ago, no one was really talking about this issue that way. Now we have tons of science, voter-approved bond funding, new state institutions dedicated to managing voter-approved funding to bay restoration, emerging guidance from the Corps, and others that support beneficial reuse of sediment and nature-based solutions, and even a few sticks among all these carrots to compel local action. So happy to talk more during the panel discussion, and thanks for having me again. And yeah, we have a long way to go and looking forward to being in this national dialogue around coastal resilience with all of you together.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Laura. So I want to connect your presentation back to Maria's because something Maria discussed earlier was that management challenge rather than a solely engineering challenge. Is that what you guys are seeing within the efforts in the Bay Area? And does that kind of resonate with you?
Management challenges are as big a problem as engineering challenges. Absolutely. I think we've moved from the era of engineering challenges where people agreed to an era to a move to an era where we have a lot of institutions that have been created for the right reasons, right? Like we want to protect water quality, we want to protect sensitive species, we want to protect habitat loss, we want to and maintain navigation. We want the state to manage its tidelands with public trust interests in mind. We want all of these things, but when you layer them on top of each other, it's almost impossible to cut through, even for the best kinds of projects, to be able to move forward with speed and at the pace that climate change requires. So I would say we're definitely in that era, and looking for pathways to cut through it. And that's why we're sponsoring legislation this year that would do just that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So, one message that has come clearly today is that we have already moved much of the science, planning tools, and increasingly the funding that may be needed to advance. So, now the challenge is implementations. And this brings us to Florida. While California has helped shape many of our national conversations around coastal resiliency and environmental policy, Florida is increasingly becoming an emerging leader in implementation, resiliency investment, and innovation. Recent efforts to streamline permitting, expand our resiliency funding, and advance project through initiatives such as the landmark Bill SB 302 for coastal resiliency has demonstrated the state's commitment to preparing the communities for sea level rise, flooding, and coastal hazards. Today, to help us understand what this looks like on the ground and what some future opportunities it will exist, I'm pleased to introduce our final presenter, Pepper Uchino. Pepper Uchino is the president of the Florida Shore and Beach Preservation Association. He is widely recognized for his expertise in environmental policy and natural resource management. Prior to leading FSBPA, Pepper served several key policies roles within Florida Senate and has worked extensively on environmental legislation and coastal management issues throughout the state. He holds a master's degree in marine affairs and policy and a law degree from the University of Miami. Pepper, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Mequela. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Hopefully this works because I switched up my desktop 1 to desktop 2. All right, can you all see that? All right, great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to ECOncrete for hosting these important discussions, my other panelists. It's almost like it was planned how well this is moving. As Mequela said, I am the president of FSBPA. We were founded in 1957. So even when Florida was kind of a vacation retreat, we had the foresight to kind of think about erosion as it impacted people. It wasn't really so much for the environment back then, but it was people. As you can see, this first picture, if you all don't know what this is Hurricane Ian in 2022, came across Punta Gorda as a very high category 4 hurricane, almost category 5, just under. Some quick facts about Florida because it's a crazy coastal state. We have the longest coastline measured linear miles in the sub 48 at 1,350 miles. Of those miles, 825 miles are sandy shoreline. So we by far have the most beaches of any state in the nation. That's over 60% of our linear miles are sandy beach, which is wild. Fishing and boating capital of the world, largest single, economic driver in Florida. They are very, very important for both the economy and the ecology of the state of Florida. Not only that, but in 2015, kind of what you would consider our CBO or CRS, we call it EDR, did a study and they showed that beaches make up by far the biggest brand identifier of the state of Florida. So whether you're talking about ecology, economy, or just brand, beaches are where you're at. So Not all good though, right? Obviously, with so many beaches, we have a lot of miles of erosion, 450 plus, 9+ miles of inlet shoreline. And these are really formed. This erosion is caused by natural forces, as you can imagine, storm systems and things like that, but also a lot of human intervention, including inlets, which cut the movement of sand south over the peninsula. If you need a visual, here's the visual. Everything in red that you see is going to be designated as a critically eroded shoreline. So you can see from the Panhandle all the way to the northeast corner of Florida, we pretty much covered the entire peninsula. So that's why this matters, right? Sea level rise, extreme weather. I think, now I don't have data to back this up, but I imagine Florida has the most assets of any state on the line because we are so low lying and we are so coastal. As Laura shared with you, there are going to be regional differences between the areas, but you can see that kind of heat map for sea level rise at 2100. You see regional variances, including the Gulf down there and Louisiana and Texas. On the right side of your screen, you'll see the southeast coast and the eastern Gulf Coast. Even though there are variances, they're pretty consistent. And then, of course, on the bottom left, you see the contiguous USA. And again, consistent but regional variations. So, it has to be planned. Interestingly enough, I chose 2080 instead of 2100 on those graphs because when big public infrastructure goes in, typically it's authorized for 50 years. And we may not want to think about that, but 50 years from now is 2080. It seems like a lifetime from now, but it is within the lifetime of these big infrastructure projects. Graphically for Florida, because that's what I'm talking about, but graphically everywhere you see blue and green or teal, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but this is what you see in 2100. So, we'll see significant impacts across the entire peninsula with an expected sea level rise. And I'm using the interagency intermediate low projections here for this particular graph. So it's important, right? Sea level rise is important. Why is it so important to Florida? 18 million people live in the coastal zone. And as I mentioned with the panelists earlier, and I'll share with you now, you cannot live anywhere in Florida and not be within 60 miles of the coast. So that means the entire peninsula basically is coastal. It may not be the oldest, but we've seen a lot of change in our Key West tide gauge, and it's accelerating. The last couple of decades have seen 6 inches of rise. So that's really accelerating because it's only been about 10.5 inches of rise since 1913 when it started recording. So we're seeing that acceleration in Florida. Not only can we see it in the gauges, but we can see it on the ground. We're experiencing sunny day flooding, worsening king tides, accelerating coastal erosion, more devastating storm surge. And then just think about sea level rise on top of that. It's going to accelerate and exacerbate all those damages from storms. This is one of my favorite slides. It looks like a kindergartner just scribbled on it, but this is the history from 1900 of tropical systems, of hurricanes, and of major hurricanes in the state of Florida. So there's a reason why we're called Hurricane Alley, because we are in the bullseye. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? You can see in this graph, and even tropical systems can have major impacts if they have a lot of energy. So this is what we're contending with. And the economics are why this slide is so important because we have to plan for all that stuff. Of the 25 costliest storms hit the United States, highlighted in yellow, are you going to see those that impacted Florida? The vast majority of them are primarily impactful of Florida. The ones with the asterisks are ones that didn't necessarily directly hit Florida, but had major impacts. So 13 of the 25 most costly storms in the United States hit Florida. This makes sense then if you hear about the history of hurricanes, this makes sense what this graphic shows. And Texas, Louisiana, Florida are the leaders for repetitive loss properties for FEMA and NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program. We lead, those 3 states unfortunately have the mark of leading the nation in terms of repetitive loss properties. And so when we're talking about the economics, we cannot ignore these repetitive loss properties because you need additional management or structures in place to deal with these sorts of impacts. Now, Also, going to that repetitive loss property, now we're looking at a graphic that shows what the acute exposure in Florida. Now, this data is a little bit old. I couldn't find any updated data on this, but it's a good graphic representation about, in the near future, kind of, the next 20 years or so, and then out to 2100. We can see just how impactful it is in terms of number, in terms of amount, in terms of tax base at risk. I should mention on that third, the lowest, the blue one, we do have a constitutional amendment pending in Florida that would wipe out property taxes. It'd be the first in the nation. And so that particular, the blue maps down there may not be accurate after November if 60% of the voting population passes this. We will be wiping out a significant portion of property taxes in the near 2 years, and then with a mandate for the legislature to continue to reduce property taxes in Florida until they are completely gone. So hurdles, right? This is all management for Florida. We have a lot of hurdles that we have to deal with, and we have this coastal management toolbox that we use. Now, I'm not going to go through all of them. Our other presenters have talked about a lot of these tools that we will be using, and a lot of them are used simultaneous in conjunction with other ones. But in Florida, as I mentioned previously, because beaches are such an incredible portion, both in terms of the economics and the actual percentage of our coastline, we use beach management and beach nourishment as one of the primary tools, though, to fight both erosion and sea level rise. You can see this picture here on the left that shows you kind of what a restoration looks like. And we use these in conjunction. And as Laura was saying, nature-based solutions have really been coming online recently. And I'm going to get into a little bit about our landmark bill that we passed, 302, because we have the same issues in Florida in terms of it's harder to permit because those permitting pathways for the previous way of doing things are so well established that anytime you change that up, you're going to have these problems that innovative solutions have. So beaches, right? I'm the president of the Beaches Association. I can't go without talking about specifics of beach nourishment. It's a win-win-win. It does a lot of things, right? It helps the economy. It helps upland infrastructure to reduce storm surge damage, and it helps the environment because beaches serve as critical habitat for a lot of listed and threatened species. So it really has this win-win-win, especially when it's done right. Now, in the past, things have been not done right and we've had impacts, but we have extensive monitoring that oftentimes goes from cycle to cycle where there's never a gap in monitoring. So we take this very seriously in terms of how these projects are impacting both the ecology and the economy of the state. We have a long commitment because of how they important are to the state of Florida. 40 years of policy, 25 years of programmatic funding, billions of dollars have gone in the maintenance of them with additional storm damage recovery dollars that come after storms. It promotes buy-in from the local governments, from the local populous communities, and with the federal and state governments as well. And of those, if you recall, 825 miles, we have over 265 miles of actively managed beaches. Here's just a graphic that shows kind of everywhere. It's everywhere. Here's some pictures that, because pictures are worth 1,000 words, this can really show you kind of the impacts of what a restoration or nourishment looks like. These are Jacksonville pre and post. This is Atlantic Beach pre and post. This is post-storm damage recovery. And you can see here, this is Melbourne. And so you can see the undermining of the structures here. And then you can see what the restoration did. And then you can see how it performed in storms. So performed beautifully, took the brunt of the damage and actually performed better than we expected. So this leads us into overall coastal resilience policy. The Resilient Florida program, which was started in 2021, has seen rapid growth. In fact, we probably, this says nearly 4 billion because I couldn't get this year's numbers, but probably after this year, we'll exceed 4 billion in both state and local funding for it. We initially started, like Laura was saying, we started with this assessments and we're transitioning to implementation now. And so these billions of dollars are actually going towards projects. And you have to be in the vulnerability assessment. You have to have done a vulnerability assessment in order to even qualify for this implementation grant funding. So, it's that step by step that Dr. Petrova also mentioned and that Laura was talking about. This is the big one, right? This is what we've been going down. I know it's a lot of words. I'm not going to talk about it, but basically, what we are trying to do with this law is get consistency with green, hybrid, or nature-based solutions as it exists with hardened gray infrastructure. Hardened gray infrastructure is well known. Everybody can do it. I mean, it takes longer, it takes shorter, but it's a very well-known pathway. These other innovative solutions, nature-based solutions, even though we know that they can sometimes perform better, like Laura was saying, they can be cheaper, they can be easier to amend and mitigate for adaptive management, they're harder to permit. And so this bill will hopefully cause the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to lead the way on consistency for permitting. Recommendations, I'm not going to go through all these, but I think the best money we can spend is pre-storm, and the worst money we can spend is post-storm. It's least effective. When you're trying to just do anything as quickly as possible, that's the least effective money that you can spend. So pre-storm, this funding, this consistency is where it's at. And then post-storm, hopefully, when we have these resiliency plans and adaptation strategies, then post-storm can be much better funded for those as well. So that's my presentation. I kind of ran through it. Sorry, I ran a little bit over. I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions, and hopefully I did so. But if you have any questions, happy to answer anything. And again, thank you to ECOncrete and Mequela for holding this, and to my other panelists.
Awesome. Thank you guys for that. So we are at 124, so we will open up for a panel discussion. At the moment, we don't have any questions in the Q&A. So I would like to bring all my panelists back together. And I want to return back to the question I asked in the beginning. So when you guys think about the future of coastal infrastructure, what is the single biggest change needed to move from isolated pilot projects to widespread adoption? We'll start off with Maria, then Laura, and then end with Pepper.
I would say better coordination among agencies, a better exchange of data, using the same types of data that can be interpreted differently, but sharing the results and the thinking that goes behind it. Again, better communication, I think, is key among these agencies. Using trained people who can help with interpreting the information, and having the resources to conduct the necessary community engagement processes that could provide input into the long-term decision making as well.
Okay, Laura, over to you now.
Yeah, I'll say, I mean, it's a variety of things. I think the pilot projects need to have better marketing because we almost need to share more broadly their success and their effectiveness in order to prove to the wide variety of permitting agencies and even local governments who have to do something about addressing their shoreline, but like they're going to be pretty risk averse, right? Like if there's not necessarily proof that this type of hybrid approach or nature-based solution works and it can be done for a similar cost, like you're not going to be the one who wants to hang your hat on that hook, right? I think it needs to be, we need like great marketing for some of these approaches in order to prove their worth, and then we'll see more widespread adoption because they will have multiple benefits, and they will bring not only coastal resilience, but like recreation, access, like like more habitat, more multi-benefits. So I think that's one thing. And then the other one that I think I've already said that many times, but like we need to find a way to create pathways to permitting those things so that they aren't just like a challenging pilot projects that state agencies can get or any type of permitting a regulator can get tripped up on. Like more yes than wait, let's assess. Oh, I like the rhyming there. More yes than assess.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm corny sometimes.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Maria and with Laura. It's in Florida, we are trying to do something. That's what 302 was about, right? Because even though we just ramped up this, literally before 2021, not a single dollar was spent in this Resilient Florida program. It was started in there, and now, we're in the billions. And but the idea that you have to, right, tie this science and adaptive management to the funding, and having that funding be consistent is critical, right? Because to Laura's point, if you're a local government and you have this issue that you need to solve, or even a regional area that you need to solve, one type of infrastructure is going to work, and you don't know another one is, then you're not going to do it. You're just not going to do it, right? Because your communities have immediate needs, and if you're not solving them, then you're not meeting the challenge, right? So, having that assessment to innovative solutions to then this streamlined permitting, as they both said, I think is really critical. And as I say all over when I talk about resilience and coastal resilience, I say, like, every dollar this state has to spend has to be a resilient dollar now. Like, from this point forward, every dollar, because it has to do multiple things. We do not have enough money to throw individual dollars at this system. They have to be multifunction dollars. And so that's one of the things I harp on, is just like every dollar has to do more.
Awesome. And I totally agree with that. I'm out here in Fort Lauderdale, so I want my tax dollars spent on resilient dollars. I'm with you on that one, Pepper. So we are at time at 1:29. So I want to thank all my panelists for joining us as well, and the participants in the audience. So it's really, our discussion really was about not really creating infrastructure that performs, adapts, and support ecosystems, but also needs to strengthen our community as well, and must deliver long-term value. So on behalf of ECOncrete, thanking my panelists again, thank you guys all for joining, and you guys have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for attending.
Yeah.